Welcome everyone to this CPD. My name is Magdalena. I'm a Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for CAT Scotland East. We're joined here today by Richard Atkins and Gary Mees. Gary will be running the show today, so I'll pass on to Gary to introduce himself and also to introduce Richard. Gary, over to you.
Thanks, Magdalena, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along for this little session. Another one of the little sessions which get recorded and put up on our Scotland East YouTube channel for people to go back to. I think I must say today I'm quite delighted to actually getting Richard along today, because I've worked with Richard, I think, about 15, 16 years since the inception of the RIS regs. Richard's a chartered architect. His focus is on sustainable building design and as a consultant, and he's notable for his advocating environmental responsible architecture. He advises clients, government and other stakeholders. As I say, Richard's here today to talk about certification as in his capacity of Head's technical advisor. I've worked with RIS regs for that length of time, and I sit on the panel as a panel member and auditor. We'd ask you welcome, Richard, if you want to come in and introduce yourself and take the show.
Great, thank you, Gary, for that wonderful introduction. I don't know there's much more that I can add to that, but yes, as Gary says, I've been interested in sustainable, responsible architecture for best part of 25 years or more, of which energy is a big part, emissions are a big part. It's not the be all and end all, but it is a very significant part. Back in around 2006, the RIS was approached by what was then Scottish Building Standards Agency, now the Building Standards Division, with regard primarily to energy performance certificates, which were coming along. Their point was that architects and others obviously design new buildings and they would need EPCs. And without going through the whole history of that, where we ended up was actually establishing a certification of design scheme for Section 6. And we now have two parallel schemes, one domestic, which was the original one, and Gary's been involved from pretty much day one, and a non-domestic scheme that we introduced alongside or with the support of CIPSE. So today's presentation is just to talk a little bit about the building regulatory system and how that works and where certification fits in. And also to highlight to you that we are launching a new CPD membership version of the scheme, which gives those who want to know more but don't necessarily want to become full certifiers of design, it gives you access to a lot of the information and the support that we provide all of the members of the scheme. For some reason, I've not got the cursor on the right screen. There we go. Well, I'm going to do a shameless plug. Alongside my role at the RIS and as a practice architect, I am a member of CEDA, and in fact, I'm a former chair of CEDA, the Scottish Ecological Design Association. We have a number of publications that either we've produced or we support, and two of them are on the screen. And these are available to purchase from ceda.uk.net shop. And would encourage you all to have a look at that, or indeed hopefully join. The cost of joining CEDA is actually very, very low. CEDA was established in 1991 and has done a huge amount to promote sustainability, provide design guides, etc., etc. So that's a shameless plug. So why do we have a regulatory system, building regulatory system? Well, first of all, it's to prevent buildings falling down, it's to prevent them burning down, it's to ensure that drains work, ensure adequate ventilation and protection. So all of those things are life-safe issues, particularly the first two, but equally drains and ventilation are significant contributors to life-safe issues. Over the years, the Scottish regulatory system has grown some arms and legs, quite rightly. So, for example, maximising accessibility. Initially, to minimise CO2 emissions. That, as I'm sure everyone will be aware, with the latest versions of the technical standards, is shifting back to energy. The reason it's shifting back to energy is because a recognition on the part of the Scottish Government that the Scottish electricity grid is virtually zero decarbonised. And that was a pretty impressive echo. I don't know if everybody heard that. Yeah, the grid is now effectively decarbonised, and the most recent change to the technical standards in Section 6 is to remove the opportunity or the option to have emissions emitting heating systems, direct emissions heating systems in new buildings. I'm sure many of you will be aware there's now been a slight twist on that tail in that a recent ministerial direction does now allow the use of log burners and peat fires in certain circumstances. But generally speaking, for mainstream housing, the opportunity for gas boiler, oil boiler, LPG boiler has gone. And of course, if you take away the emissions, you've got nothing left to regulate against it. And quite clearly, part of what we need to do from a regulatory point of view is to ensure that we are building as good building fabric as possible so that we can minimize energy. Because although the grid, like I say, is decarbonised, and I think roughly 30% of Scottish electricity is currently exported, it still only provides about 22% of the energy consumption within Scotland. So that's 78% that isn't electrically fueled. Roughly half of that is transport, and half of that is heating buildings. So the surplus electricity we've got is nowhere near to compensate for getting rid of gas effectively at the moment. But that is the direction of travel, obviously. And then certainly uniquely when it was introduced, and I think it probably is still unique, we have a section promoting sustainability. And within that section 7, a lot of that is still currently quite voluntary. A lot of that is quite tentative in many ways, but that's how the regulatory system starts. And I'll touch on that in a minute. So there is a regulatory hierarchy in Scotland. At the top of that is the 2003 Act, which gives the ministers powers to create the regulations, and that's primary legislation. The reason for this hierarchy is primary and secondary legislation is really quite hard to change. It takes a lot of time within the Scottish Parliament to change these things. So the second tier below that is the regulations themselves. Secondary legislation, my understanding, is not so difficult to change and be amended, but it's still, like I say, it takes parliamentary time. Below that, you then have the technical handbooks giving guidance. And Scottish ministers are empowered under the 2004 regulations to approve changes to the technical handbooks. So it's a way of ensuring that as we've seen recently, quite frequent changes to the technical handbooks, if not annually, every couple of years, those can actually go through after suitable scrutiny, but they can go through fairly quickly. They don't need a huge amount of parliamentary time. There's also a range of additional supplementary guidance, and this also has the same statutory impact or relevance as the main technical standards. So just some of the technical advice over and above the technical standards that are available are the Building Services Compliance Guides, the accredited details. Now, these have actually now been withdrawn from BSD's website, but they still are out there. You can still reference them. You can still apply them, although you do need to be extremely careful of how you do apply them. If you are applying them and using the values that they have for psi values, for example, in a SAP calculation, you need to replicate those details precisely. So they've not kind of lost their statutory position, if you like, but the recognition is that as the technical standards have gone forward, the details from 2005 are probably not going to be the details we would be building to now. There's also a procedural guidance on certification, and there's a procedural handbook, which I haven't got a slide of, but it's a procedural handbook as well. And those explain how the processes work. And I suspect, in fact, I know from my architectural colleagues, I suspect there's a fair lack of ignorance about the fact that those documents exist and that we should be following them when we are applying for a building warrant. So it's literally the process. And of course, there's the Practitioner's Guide 6, of which there's 2 parts published by Historic Environment Scotland, which have the same status as the technical standards. And I have been involved in the past in potentially doing some reviews of that as well. And there is a host of other guidance out there, which it is legitimate to refer to within a building warrant application, whether an individual verifier, as in the local authority or building control officer, will accept that guidance is a matter of discussion and debate. One of the things that I think is interesting about the whole regulatory system is because it's performance-based, the onus is on the applicant, or effectively the agent, us if we're putting the building warrant in, to highlight where guidance supports whatever the design that we have developed and are seeking a building warrant for it. So that can open up a certain level of debate and discussion, which, if you go down the route of becoming a certifier of design, you can slightly body swerve to a certain extent. You can't avoid the technical standards, the regulations, but it puts more onus on the decision-making process of the certifier. But we'll get to that very, very quickly. So how do things get into the regulations? Well, firstly, it has to be an issue that the regs can actually address. It has to be significant enough to justify adding to the technical standards. You have to have a proportionate solution, and it has to be enforceable. And an example of this, many years ago, I sat on a workshop, working group for sections 3 and 4 of the technical standards. And one of the questions that we looked at or were asked was to do with finger trapping in new dwellings. And so we were aware that there was an issue there. It does happen. But at the time, my kids were still very young, and that was always something I'd always been really worried about, doors slamming, fingers getting trapped, because it happened to me when I was a kid. A bit of research was done to identify how many people present at hospital, and it was actually relatively few, and the level of injury was relatively small throughout Scotland, which was very good news. We then looked at the potential solution, which would be to provide something like rubber plasticky guards at door jambs, as you often see in commercial premises. But we felt that that wasn't really proportionate. The cost of doing that per new dwelling at the time was £200–300, something like that. And then we had to think about, was it enforceable? And the reality was, we felt that a lot of people buying a new home with these sort of guards on at the hinges would probably take them off, and building control departments would have no idea. So yes, there was an issue there. It wasn't actually as significant as perhaps you might think. The solution probably wasn't very proportionate, and it probably wasn't enforceable. So, but it was a very useful exercise to go through, to think about how you get things into the regulations. And things, when they go into the regulations, tend to start as some guidance, and then they tend to become a standard, which is enforced relatively mildly, and then that standard is increased. So an example of that would be air tightness, first introduced as guidance, then introduced as sampling. Now the current regulations require air tightness testing for all new buildings, quite rightly. The industry has got used to that and has built that capacity. There's some important things to remember. Compliance is based, as it says, on performance requirements in the regulations, and it's a permit-based system. So it's not there to protect the building owner. It's not there to protect you and I as designers or contractors. It's only there to protect the building owner insofar as they are a member of the public. And what building control officers do is they take a risk-based analysis to compliance. They're looking for the non-compliances. What the process doesn't guarantee is that anything is particularly well designed and fit for purpose. And what I mean by that is you can build a house with bathrooms in the wrong place and kitchens that are a long way from the dining room, and or you know, you can build buildings which just don't really work for clients. The regulations can't tell that. They can't respond to that, and they don't guarantee that things are necessarily well built. Obviously, there's a level of structural integrity or inspection that goes on, and you know, things like drainage tests, etc. That sort of level of scrutiny is undertaken by the local authority, but all of the sort of British standards that would tell you whether the joints are neat and even in a facing brick wall, that doesn't apply at this through this process. If a facing brick wall looks awful, as long as it's solid and it's standing up, that's fine as far as the regulatory process is concerned. And it doesn't actually guarantee that buildings are compliant. The process, all the process delivers is like I say, it's a permit-based system where a warrant has been granted because the local authority has reassured themselves that they have not found a non-compliance. But they could find a non-compliance at any point during the process, and the building owner is the person who is directly liable for that, albeit they may have all sorts of contractual relationships with designers and contractors, but it's the building owner, the applicant for the building warrant, who is the responsible person effectively. I won't go into a great deal of detail about the Passivhaus standard. I'm sure you'll all be aware there's been a consultation, or the first of a two-stage consultation from the Scottish Government, which certainly the RAS has responded to. I'm pretty certain CIAT has responded to. I understand from them they've had something like 350 responses, which is a fantastic response rate. I think that probably covers a very wide spectrum of opinion. This is my interpretation of the Passivhaus standard. It has four sort of building blocks, if you like. The first of which is a calculation methodology, PHPP, which conforms to the same standard as SAP and SBEM. And there's huge debate about which of these, if any of them, are necessarily fit for purpose. The standard was written and introduced by the European Union after most countries had already written their national calculation methodology, which is what SAP SBEM is. So it's quite a broad church, but now's not the time to go into that debate. It provides a quality insurance environment where buildings are thoroughly tested. There's a certain level of post-occupancy evaluation. There's a requirement to document how the building has been built. And again, that's partly what we do within the certification of design sphere. We're certainly talking to the Scottish Government about how that could pick up on some of those aspects which the Passivhaus Institute Passivhaus Trust do in terms of that documentation. That I think is doable within our system by creating a certification of construction scheme, but there's a lot of fine detail about exactly what that looks like and how that would work, but it's doable. There's certainly a high threshold of compliance which focuses on fabric first, which certainly I'm absolutely in agreement with, and again that can be built into the technical standards, whether that's using PHPP, whether that's using SAP, or the new version of SAP, the home energy model, which is again under consultation from the UK government, which has aspects of simulation within it, which I think could be a much better tool to use in the future. But again, it might come with significantly more time input and software requirements than SAP or PHP. These were all developed to be ready reckoners rather than the likes of simulation. And then the final aspect, and again, this is another one of great controversy, so I won't go into it in great detail, but it's the level of prescriptive approach to design within Passivhaus. There are some people, such as myself, that would argue that it is quite prescriptive. I know a lot of Passivhaus designers would say it's not because it's blind to construction methodologies. But again, that's the debate that's been had around this thing. But my fear of a prescriptive approach is simply, if you can only build something in one particular approach, what happens about the unintended consequences? What happens if we discover at some point that prescriptive approach just happens to be the wrong one or has a flaw in it? And we see this we see this quite frequently in the construction industry, where a level of prescription arrives, rack being a good example, which subsequently we discover that actually, it has a sting in the tail. But there's a big debate about that. So, okay, so where does certification of design section 6 fit into all of this? Well, firstly, the Scottish ministers have been very supportive, certainly in words. We've argued long and hard that perhaps it should be mandatory, and we never know. There might be a possibility that happens, but they're keen to see certification become the norm. And again, this is all to do with raising standards, and I think also over the years we've seen local authorities come to realise that the amount of detail that now goes into section 6 it is incredibly onerous for them to actually check that every application is meeting the level of detail, and they're now looking at, as they do for section 1, they are now looking for certification to become the norm, partly because their resources are so limited. The opportunity to become a certifier of design or create a certification of design scheme is unique to Scotland. As I mentioned before, we have 2 schemes, and they sit alongside the Building Research Establishment scheme. I'm sure everyone will be very familiar with SER. SER was there first, and the way our scheme is structured, and BRE scheme as well, is very much follows the way that the structural engineers do it, if you like, or started doing it, and their scheme has been extremely successful because they effectively had a form of certification going way back, and they when the 2003-2004 legislation was passed, they restructured that to fit in. There are also certification construction schemes run by SNP, Select and Searchshore, which cover plumbing, heating and electrical systems. I'm a huge supporter of those because I always, perhaps it's my doomy, gloomy nature, I see those schemes particularly as protecting the client, because they are covered by a backstop guarantee. If the plumber gets something wrong, the electrician gets something wrong and disappears over the hill, those organisations will step in and help put it right, and usually help put it right without a further cost to the client. And I always think of myself standing in court with a KC saying, so you went out to tender, but you didn't require the subcontractors to provide certification of construction certificates, which would have protected your client. Should that not be a general minimum requirement? And I think I'd have to answer to say yes. That that would have been, I had probably had a duty of care to have done that. All the certifiers of design and construction appear on the certification register. And again, I know that the Building Standards Division are looking at how they can improve that register and strengthen that register, so that at the moment it's a simple lookup of, on that date, was the approved certifier of design, was the approved body, as the terminology is, were they on the register? Hopefully in the future it will actually drill down a bit further and say, actually, we know there's a certificate that's been registered. So the certification of design process, this shows how it fits into that warrant application process. So if a design certificate is submitted, verifier checks the validity of the certificate, you get a 10% discount for that certification of design certificate, and that's for each one. So if you've got if you've got an SER certificate and a Section 6 certificate, you get 20% discount. You can get further discount. In fact, for the very smaller warrants, it's now more than 10%. And you can also get a discount if you're saying that you're going to have certificates of construction at the end. One of the useful changes that was made quite a while ago now, a few years ago now, is you don't have to now submit the certificates at the warrant application process. You can merely state that they will be coming. And the benefit of that is that when the certificate of design is finally produced, it can be based on the warrant application drawings, which may have been amended during the warrant reporting stage. So you're not doing it and then going back and either redoing it or providing a letter of comfort. But it also means building control officer knows that they don't have to look at Section 1, they don't look at Section 6. On the report, they purely say, give us those certificates when they're ready. If there's no design certificate, the verifier has to undertake necessary checks. Most of you probably won't be aware, but LABS, the Local Authority Building Standards Scotland, produce equivalence guidance for local authorities, which tells them what they should be doing in checking Section 6 in terms of checking SAP calculations, SPEM calculations. And I should say, certification applies to all building work. So it applies to conversions, extensions, alterations. You can even produce a certificate when you're doing something that's so minimal that there isn't actually a Section 6 issue, because you're actually confirming, I've checked this, there isn't a Section 6 issue. So it's much wider than just new buildings. But the equivalent guidance outlines what the local authorities should be doing to check each application, and it's pretty onerous. It's very difficult to check a SAP calculation without doing it again. Same would be true of SPEM, same would be of a PHPP calculation, all of these things. There are ways to spot where mistakes or poor entries have gone in, but actually the only way to really do it is do it again. And with SPEM, it's a black box, so it's very difficult. This diagram explains the relationships. The wording within certification can get quite strange. Approved bodies, approved certifier of design, certification coordinators are all terminology that's common to all of the schemes. Every approved body has to have an approved certifier of design and a certification coordinator. All three can be the same person. So an approved body can be a sole trader, for example, who is the certifier and is the coordinator. But it's to ensure that that person knows they've got three different hats for different things, and they have a relationship to the scheme, having demonstrated registration, competency, etc., and the scheme audits them. The scheme in turn has an approval from the building standards division, and they audit us, and we deliver the scheme based on agreed procedures, if you like, and the way we test competency, etc., is all agreed and is all common. The approved body is the entity that actually is responsible for the certificate, but the certificate is produced by an individual certifier of design. That goes to the verifier, and obviously the verifier also has a relationship with the Scottish Government. There are minimum thresholds of competency to become a member, and we ensure and make sure everybody meets these, including undertaking various tests, etc. And that's to ensure that everybody's on the same playing field. And there's a lot of stuff on our website. If you want to download the guidance on how you become a member, it's all there publicly available, and obviously keen to encourage everyone to do that. The process of certification is done within the quality assurance environment, so it's checklist based, certification checklist based, and it's a matter of going through the technical standards that apply to the particular project and ensuring that there's evidence within the warrant package that satisfies you as a certifier of design that it is compliant. I think that might be a duplicate. No, that's just more of an explanation on the quality assurance environment. I'm sure these slides will be available after today, so you can come back and read the detail of that. But again, it's making sure that records are kept, and we're therefore able to audit those as part of our normal processes. Insurances and liabilities are an interesting one. Yeah, clearly everyone has to carry PI insurance. Very early doors, I had a conversation with RS Insurance Services Limited, and the question I asked was, are we creating additional liabilities that we need to have additional insurances for? And interestingly, the answer from the insurance providers were, well, actually, what you're demonstrating is a higher level of competency. So if anything, the cost of insurance should be lower. Now, I'm not quite sure, that's if you're certifying alongside your own project. So you can both certify your own projects and you can certify those of others. How true that might be, I'm not absolutely certain, but I thought it was a really interesting take that they didn't see that you're taking on an additional liability, which of course we're not. We're, you know, when we take on a project to produce a building warrant, even if it's not explicit within that appointment, it is implicit that we should be designing in line with the requirements of the building regulations, which of course we know is not necessarily as hard and fast as perhaps the general public would think, because it goes back to this performance requirement. One of the other key things about certification of design, and again important to remember, is the role of the local authority verifiers is not to be a member of the design team, and they are looking to see that the minimum thresholds of compliance are achieved. They're not there to help optimize the building. Good building controllers, and they often do, but if they see something on a building warrant that looks either counterintuitive or slightly strange way of doing it, they might raise that. But if you want to gold plate your application, or if you want to create a design which is not particularly cost effective, let's say, that's up to you. That's up to the applicant. So an example of that would be thinking about MVHR and airtightness, which, interestingly, there's quite a lot of questions about that on our online tests. And as we'll all be aware, they tend to go together. If you've got very high levels of air tightness, or very low levels of air infiltration, however you want to look at it, the regulations will move you towards an MVHR system. You don't have to put an MVHR system in, but it probably makes a lot of sense to think about an MVHR system. If you're installing an MVHR system, then it makes absolute sense to have a very, very airtight building. It will run very inefficiently if you don't. However, those two things aren't actually linked in the regulations. The technical standards do not prevent you having a MVHR system and having a very poorly airtight, if that's the right phrase, poor airtightness result. What will happen is, when you do, if it's a new building, if you do a SAT calculation or an SBEM calculation, or indeed a BHPP calculation, it will give you a really poor result. And in terms of the technical standards, it would probably push you to put in more PV on the roof and a battery storage, or improving something else somewhere else. But the two aren't linked. So it's an example of the fact that if you can show that the calculation works, you can do slightly bonkers things. The regulations can't stop you, and they're not really intended to stop you. But the role of the certifier of design is that we're part of a wider design team, and we are therefore able, I mean, we may actually be the designer of the building. Like I say, you can certify your own designs, or you might be sitting within that team. You can work with the other designers and the client, looking at things like thermal bridging calculations, for example, but helping to optimize that design, which isn't necessarily the same as achieving compliance at the lowest cost. It might be that the client is very keen to achieve an extremely low Passivhaus certifiable project, in which case there's a role for the certifier of design to help achieve that. And I have worked on buildings that have achieved Passivhaus certification, and part of that has been that discussion of, well, what if we do this, what if we do that, where's the best place to spend the money, which tends to be on the fabric, not least because you've got to meet certain criteria on that in terms of Passivhaus. But it means you are helping as part of the design team, which the local authority verifier is not there to do. I mentioned quality environment. All the designs that are certified have to be certified by suitably qualified and experienced professionals, and it provides that assurance service and conforms to design compliance with the regulations. So it's about providing quality, compliance, and confidence. And unlike the uncertified projects, if you like, where a building warrant is that permit that I mentioned before, when you certify compliance with Section 6 or indeed with Section 1, it's a guarantee that it complies. The only place that can be questioned is actually in a court of law. So it's quite a quite an onerous thing to take on in a way. I'd mentioned already some of the additional benefits. in terms of support design optimization. Most certifiers of design in the scheme will also be a member of what's called an approved organization, which means they can produce EPCs at the end of the project. The logic in that is you're usually using the same calculation. You may have to revise the calculation if there have been changes on site. Very occasionally there will have been a change in the software or the version of SAP or SBEM between the building warrant and completion. But mostly it stays the same. And in fact, at the moment, we've got the slightly strange situation where we are currently using SAP 10 to demonstrate compliance with the current technical standards. However, if anyone's finished a building on SAP 10 so far, you will have to lodge an EPC using SAP 2012. And I don't know with all the software, but certainly the 2 software packages I use, they're not backwards compatible as far as I can see. So we might find ourselves having to redo calculations for an older version. But the reason for that is so that EPCs that we're lodging today are directly comparable to all the EPCs that have been lodged for the last 10 or so years, since 10, maybe 8 years since SAP 2012 came along. As I mentioned before, it's not just about minimum standards, of course. The building regulations, like any standards, are the minimum thresholds for compliance. So there's the opportunity for the certifiers of design to assist clients wishing to go further, such as Passivhaus standard or net zero solutions, etc. And it certainly helps clients negotiate the complexity of Section 6 energy. I do quite a lot of work with other architects and contractors, and the sooner I can become involved in projects, the better, because one of the things I see quite a lot of is I'll be asked to get involved quite often that kind of warrant stage when the architect who's putting the application in realizes maybe I don't know enough about Section 6, I need someone else to come and help on that, and they present me a set of beautifully worked up drawings, and I have to deliver the bad news of, well, actually, if you want to get this through, you probably need to improve that level of insulation, which means all your external walls are now a bit thicker, which means you've got to go back and do a huge amount of redrawing, even if it's just to get an extra 25 mil, 50 mil of insulation into that wall thickness. So potentially it creates an immense amount of abortive work, which could have been avoided by a much earlier conversation and an initial calculation of, well, this is where this particular design is sitting. There are ways to, if it's not compliant, there are ways to get it compliant. It could be adding PVs, it could be adding insulation, it could be better air tightness, it could be a host of things, depending on which way the client wants to go. So it's, if you're going to optimize your design work, the sooner you can start, the sooner you can do a reality check calculation to make sure that you're on the right course, the better, because the devil is very much in the detail. And as we all know, retrospectively engineering a design which has perhaps started from the slightly wrong place is always a difficult and potentially painful process. So how do you join the scheme? Well, anyone who is registered with ARB or is a chartered CIAT member, or indeed low carbon consultant, you pre-qualify. So all we have to do, if you apply to join, all we have to do is check ARB register or CIAT. Yes, they're a chartered member, and we can press a button and you can move along to the next stage. So the next stage is subscribing and paying some money. We have to make some money to run the scheme, obviously. And we then give you 6 online tests. There's a whole host of learning material that comes with the scheme, which points you in the direction of the technical standards and all the guidance. And the tests cover six modules. The first of which is how the scheme process works. All of the new designations, you know, what is an approved body, what is a certifier of design, etc. And then the others go through various bits of the technical standards, including looking at those other parts of the technical standards that relate to Section 6. When you certify that Section 6 is compliant, you don't check the rest of the regulations, but you are doing a reality check of, am I certifying something that could be very difficult to deliver because of other sections in the regulation? So in other words, on this design, I see that the external walls are built out of cotton wool, which is lovely. That's going to be very well insulating. No problem from a Section 6 point of view, but hang on, how does cotton wool stand up? That's going to be a bit of a problem with Section 1 and structures. So it's that sort of reality test. The online tests are designed to get people to think through how the regulations are structured and follow the regulatory logic. And I always say to everyone, as I'm sure everybody does, when you read a clause in the regulations, you have to ask yourself, firstly, what is this trying to get me to do? And then you have to ask yourself, and what does it let me get away with? And if I can get away with it because of this clause, is there another clause somewhere else that stops me? It's a bit like that airtightness MVHR. Yes, there's no clauses that stop you having poor airtightness and MVHR. There are other clauses that say you've got to have a compliant SAP calculation or SBEM calculation. Again, if it's new build. Again, we cover conversions, extensions, alterations in all of this. And what we find is, generally speaking, those who join the scheme get 70%, 80% of the questions right. You get multiple goes. If you don't get through within the number of goes we give you, I look at the answers you've given, and we can give you more goes. Sometimes that also, particularly when the regs have changed and the questions have changed, writing the questions was really the most difficult bit. Sometimes I have to go back and realise I've poorly worded something or change the answer, and that's a developing process, and that's very useful for us because we're always looking for that feedback on the tests. So it's not, although it is an examination type test, it's not. None of the questions are designed to be trick questions. At least I hope they're not. But all of them, and all of them, because they're multi-choice, all of them should have answers which on first reading are plausible, but there'll only ever be one answer which is always right in every circumstance. And again, it's getting people to understand the difference between what they would do as a designer and what the regulations are pushing them in the direction of. So I've just got a few quick small slides to go because I know we've got a Q&A session. So I'll just rattle through these quickly. After you've completed the test, we have a practical SAP test for the domestic scheme, or you have to demonstrate you can use SBEM for the non-domestic. I mentioned before we're opening up a CPD only membership scheme. This is yet to launch. We're just waiting on confirmation from BSD that they're completely happy with this, but it's to give people access to dip their toe in. And if you dip your toe in and as part of the CPD pass all the online tests which you get access to, that would count to becoming a full member, assuming you still meet all the other thresholds. And I think this is, and for that price, it delivers 12 hours of free CPD, gives you insight, etc. Counts towards full membership. I mentioned very quickly the modules, so I shall rattle through all of these. As you can see, they cover different parts of the technical standards. One of the other things that we do as a scheme, and this is my next slide is the last slide, you'll be pleased to know. But one of the things that we can do with is talk regularly to BRE and labs and the new compliance hub and BSD about interpreting the technical standards. So all of these have come from questions that we've been asked. And where we're trying to get to with labs is that we will hopefully agree a common interpretation, and then we can provide that to our members of the scheme, and to labs will provide that hopefully to verify, so that we are all on the same page for what are in some ways real nitty gritty little interpretations, some of which can change, like the log burning stoves. So that's me. I think that takes us on to the Q&A session. I think we've got about 15 minutes to go. So hopefully there's lots of questions out there. And I will stop sharing now.
Thanks, Richard. That was very concise. Sorry, I had to put my camera on because just to kind of speed things along a bit. I'm surprised that we've not got many questions, but some questions that came into my mind as we're talking through it. And of course, I'm quite used to the scheme, being a member of it, is that one of the daunting things I thought to myself, as we're presenting this, we've got to keep our data for 25 years. Can you perhaps explain how we do that?
Yes, that's a very good point. So yeah, that is a requirement. It's the same requirement that local authorities have. I find it quite scary that after 25 years they might not be keeping it. I mean, I've kept everything since I started practicing in 2000. But yeah, what we have is we have set up for every certifier of design, we've set up a cloud storage folder for them through a company called sync.com. And every time someone produces a certificate, what we require them to do is to lodge that certificate and all the background information in their sync.com folder, along with other stuff. And every so often we will add to that the latest versions of the regulations, for example. So there's a lot of stuff that we put in there. So it becomes their certification logbook, and we will maintain that forever. And that has two benefits. Firstly, it automatically means that the certifiers meet that requirement. It also means that from an auditing point of view, we can dip in and see what people have been doing. And when we audit, as you know, Gary, we are ordering, what we are auditing is the procedure. We're not looking at individual building warrants and certificates and going, right, does this comply? We're not going back over and doing what the certifier does. If we see something obvious that gives us cause concern, we'd have a conversation with the certifier. You know, are you sure? That's certainly one of the things that we do and have done in the past. But we are looking at the procedure. So what we're looking to see, like any audit process, is everything? Are all the ducks lined up? Are they all in place? And by providing that as that cloud storage, it makes it hopefully very easy for certifiers. And it also makes it easier for us when we're auditing. And of course, we can then demonstrate to the Building Standards Division, who audit us, that we've done all this.
We have a question. Fraser Angus, I'm currently a member of the BRE scheme, which offers very little to members other than the functionality to create certificate. Does the RIS have member benefits and technical support? It was one I was going to perhaps not so much that question, but my point was going to raise that the RIS scheme is for members. It's not there. It's got to clean its nose, which it probably hasn't yet. But that was the intention of the setup, and that's why I certainly support it. But I'll leave you to complete that maybe question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the RIS saw it very much as a member's service, and we're happy for it to be wider and take in CIAT and CIBSE as well, and other construction professionals. We do provide, I hope, quite a lot of support. I field technical questions quite a lot. That's where that sort of list of interpretations has largely come from. Some have come from labs as well. I'm always keen, if people have got a question, they can email me. I'll try and respond. It will usually be a question someone else has asked me, might have a slightly different nuance. I will go and talk to the guys at Labs and the Hub and BSD and the likes of Gary as well. We'll take it to the review panel to see if we can form an opinion and advise the certifier. We did a long time ago now, at the beginning of or really reasonably close to the beginning of the scheme, we had a users forum, an online forum, and that was really useful. What we found was that over a relatively short period of time, all of the issues around that current set of regulations were aired, and I like to think of the certifiers of design as a community. We share information and knowledge, and that happened. So we actually folded the forum because it kind of fell into disuse. And I suppose one of the things we haven't done is reawakened it as the technical standards have been revised. One of the things I want to do is be a bit more active with the website. Since we originally established the scheme, we've revised the website once, a comprehensive revision, because it was 18 years ago, 17, 18 years ago. I think we'll probably do that again so that we can host things like these questions and answers. But yeah, short answer is always keen to have these queries come in. will do whatever I can to come up with a sensible answer, and keen to share those answers amongst the certification community, so that there's also a level of consistency with the verifiers as well. Yeah.
One question that I also I maybe didn't see it come up, but we've picked up that there's a potential financial saving, as in
Yes.
SER and the scheme, but there's also, in my view, we would like to think there's a timeshare. Time saving, in that your verifiers don't have to go and look at this. They basically just check that you are a certifier and then move on.
Absolutely. They will certainly say that it should speed up warrant applications. It's also another chargeable service. So again, I work with a lot of architects who previously used people just producing SAP calculations and pay a reasonable amount of money for those SAP calculations, which would then get checked by the local authority. And those same people may or may not then produce the EPCs. Well, if the certifier of design is doing it, you charge for that. And you charge a little bit more for your certificate, but the cost of the certificate that we charge is always less than the saving. But it, as you say, avoids the local authority spending that time, but it also avoids, it shouldn't be overall any more expensive. And of course, certificate fees are chargeable to the client because they're getting a saving. And so we've structured the whole thing so that the same amount of work is being done. It's just being done more efficiently with the factor of saving the time of the local authority, and therefore it shouldn't overall cost any money. It's another, like I say, it's another service that you're charging the client for, and a project cost in terms of a certificate that they're saving money by having.
Great. I'm looking for questions, but I don't see any coming up, so I'll continue. It might be worthwhile just explaining how the certification process actually works with EPCs, because obviously RIS is not an approved body in terms of EPCs.
Not an approved organisation. We have a mutual relationship with Quidos. We did originally start as being able to produce EPCs back in the day, and the reason we gave that up was the amount of auditing that was required for relatively low volumes of EPCs was too onerous for us as a scheme. We didn't have enough throughput, basically. However, we then did a deal with Quidos, which means that Quidos recognised certifiers of design as being competent to produce EPCs. Initially, they gave us a bit of discount as well, but they don't do that, I'm afraid, anymore. But it means that if you qualify as certifier of design, Quidos won't require you to do any further training to become a member, and it means you can lodge an EPC through them. And they have a relatively small annual charge, and then they have a per EPC charge, which also includes PI insurance for that EPC. And they do then audit you. But again, as a certifier of design, I mean, as any designer, you should be keeping completely accurate records of what it is you're doing. And I'll admit, in this forum, Gary will know the same. From auditing, we see some members of their scheme, everything's perfectly in place. We provide a lot of guidance how to do this. Everything's perfectly in place. And a next certifier, it's almost a shoebox full of receipts. It's that's the difference between someone running Xero or a good Excel spreadsheet and the people with a shoebox with receipts in, which I must say is frankly worrying for anyone in a way. But as certifiers of design, you are required to keep your records meticulously, like the building control, like local authorities do. But it does mean if you're audited, it's sitting there on a plate. And once you get used to the auditing process that the likes of Quidos go through, it's not that onerous. When I get an audit request, it now takes me 5 to 10 minutes to marshal the information together, and most of that time is actually just uploading it to their portal. And I provide it as a package to say, this is here, this is here, this is here, this is here, because I've got it all there because I've certified it.
it has to be said that since the scheme developed, or I should say you developed, actually some folder structure, that has made it much easier for certifiers. If they would just follow that structure as an auditor, it makes it so much easier to actually find the information that I should maybe share with it. Richard and I, in the very early days, went round offices, opening up AutoCAD files, measuring and doing all that stuff. It was rather strange when we were told by BSD that, well, no, we're not expecting you to do that. Because we don't, or the scheme actually doesn't have PI insurance to be able to criticise somebody else's designs.
Yeah, exactly right.
I'm very surprised at the lack of questions, but maybe that's because we've covered everything. We've got a couple of minutes. Magdalena, I don't know if you've got any questions that you wish to throw into the mix.
No, not really. I think Richard pretty much covered it all. It was more to do with, the legislative context, obviously, and what role we might assume for the certifier of design beyond what it already is as well. And I think predominantly around the discussion on the Passivhaus equivalent, and whether Passivhaus certifiers will be able to do the same job as the approved certifiers of design, or where will the responsibility lie? So perhaps something on that, Richard and Gary.
Yeah, well, we've been having conversations with the Passivhaus Trust, as you would expect, and certainly the view I get from that is that they're obviously keen to promote Passivhaus standard, understandably, and they're also quite keen to work with us, depending on quite where the consultation goes from BSD. I think it was quite interesting that BSD broke that consultation into two parts. I can see why they did that. My slight concern would be that is elongating the whole process of whatever output comes at the end of it, which is just delaying improvements to the technical standards. And I think everyone would be supportive of the appropriate improvements to the technical standards and requirement of performance. There's clearly a huge spectrum of opinion across the industry from, on the one end, those architects, technologists are used to working to the Passivhaus standard and are very keen to see that brought in, to probably the other end of the spectrum where house builders will see it as just adding additional cost, and can they recoup that cost from a house sale, and all sorts of different arguments of why you do this and why you do that. From a legislative point of view, it's not really possible for the Scottish government to offshore their regulatory system. You can't say, right, well, the regulations over there are really good, we'll just use that system. So they've got to find a way of integrating it into the existing system. That does mean integrating it into the technical handbooks, but that's relatively simple to do. I think they need to avoid a change to primary or secondary legislation, because that's talked about before. That's really difficult. But conceptually, there's nothing that you can't integrate, I think, into the technical handbooks. In terms of providing that quality assurance certification process, again, I conceptually, there's no reason why Section 6 certification can't take on board whatever the Passivhaus equivalence is. And we changed our pre-qualification criteria very recently to recognise that anyone who's proficient in PHPP, for example, that counts towards demonstrating pre-qualification to get into our scheme. You're dealing with someone who understands and can run some form of software and has their mind around energy performance. And I can see us building on that. Like I said before, quite how we then build on the certification of construction to the point where we can tick the boxes that Passivhaus does, but doesn't create a liability which we cannot meet. For example, the old adage of it's inspection, it's not supervision. So a certifier of construction at the moment for electrics, for plumbing, is saying I've supervised this and it is right. And of course, if we were doing that, we're not on site 24 hours a day. We're not directly employing the trades doing this, so we can't certify. We just can't certify to that point. It just wouldn't stand up legally. But I can certainly conceive that we can create a certification of construction that covers the evidence gathering and the evidence assessment that Passivhaus do. So I think it can be done, but who knows what will come out of the consultation process.
Maybe some of that will come out as part of the compliance manager as well. I see we're now sort of into, well, we're past 3 minutes past 2. And I don't say, well, somebody's asked a question. Has there ever been any discussion about extending the ACD scheme to cover Section 7? That thorny question.
Yes, it's a very good question, and we did apply at one point. And the problem we faced was the structure of the technical standards themselves, because, and I don't think this had been anticipated at the time, but because you achieve bronze level standard by just meeting all the other sections, if you were to certify this particular project meets the bronze standard, you are effectively certifying all of the other sections at the same time, which of course you can't, because you're not a certifier of section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So yeah, we tried. In terms of back to what we were just talking about, in terms of certification of construction for Passivhaus equivalent, my suggestion to BSD is one of two things: either create another bit of section 7, which can be certified, so section 7.5 or whatever it might be, I can't remember what the numbers are, and then you could certify that, which would be, you know, a Passivhaus equivalent evidence gathering process, or indeed create section 8, which would be compliance. And section 8 could be where the compliance plan manager lives, it could be where the Passivhaus equivalent lives, and therefore, as long as by certifying section 8 you're not deemed as automatically certifying other bits which you can't, then theoretically I think that should work. But that's for the regulators to try and work out how to do that. Having been on a lot of these working groups, and Gary has as well, it's a really fascinating process to be a part of. Don't necessarily listen to you on the working group or others on the working group, but it gives you an insight as to how really difficult writing regulations are when you've got a clear idea of this is what we want to achieve, and then you've got the likes of Gary and I going, but yeah, what if you do this, you know, or if you do that, or what happens when you've got this instance? You go, right, well, we need another clause to stop that. You know, it's a bit like software. Software developers will tell you 90% of software is to stop you doing the stuff that they don't want the software to do. Yeah. And only 10% is actually the stuff.
I mean, that's even more interesting, because I think I was sat on BZAC when we went through the 2003 changing of the Act, and that was, it's not just the wording, and then it has to go through the legal process. That's when things sometimes get messed up. Anyway, I think we should round things up. 6 minutes past. Richard, really thank you very much, and I hope everybody that's still online, we've lost a few, will think about and consider becoming a Certifier of Design Section 6. Magdalena, have you got anything in? Any fond words you wish to say before we go?
Just thank you, Gary and Richard, for being here today and entertaining us for over an hour. I think it was really good to cover it. We've discussed it for a long time. So thank you both for being here and for being our beacon of hope that, yes, we can get more people involved, and we can communicate better, and we can collaborate between CIT and RIAS and CIPSI and others as well. So thank you once more, and until the next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.